The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, 3 dozen personnel stared at monitors displaying nothing but empty coordinates and a blinking red indicator where a transponder used to be. Outside, the Hindu Kush Mountains cut jagged silhouettes against a sky bleeding from blue to amber. Captain Rene Spite Vasquez had been flying close air support for a SEAL team pinned down in the Korangal Valley when her A-10 Thunderbolt II simply vanished from every screen, every radar, every satellite feed tracking the operation. The last transmission had been her voice, calm and measured, calling out grid coordinates for a danger-close gun run. Then nothing. The mission commander, a colonel with 23 years of service and a face carved from disappointment, stood with his arms crossed, staring at the empty display. He'd argued against assigning Vasquez to the operation. Too inexperienced for the valley, he'd said. Too eager to prove something. The SEALs on the ground had requested close air support 40 minutes ago, trapped in a 3-sided ambush with enemy fighters closing from the high ground. Vasquez had been overhead, her A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon loaded with 30mm rounds capable of shredding cover and morale with equal efficiency. She'd made 2 passes, each one threading between mountain walls with margins measured in meters. The SEALs reported effective fire, hostiles retreating, breathing room secured. Then on the 3rd pass, her aircraft had descended into a ravine, following the enemy into terrain that swallowed radio waves and hope alike. The operations officer checked his watch. 11 minutes since last contact. In that time, 6 different attempts to raise her on multiple frequencies had yielded only static and the hollow echo of mountains that had claimed better pilots. The colonel motioned to the communications specialist, ready to declare the aircraft lost and shift assets to extraction of the ground team. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the youngest airman at the radar station leaned forward, squinting at his screen. Perhaps it was the faint rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. Outside, maintenance crews paused their work. Pilots standing near the flight line turned their faces toward the mountains. The rumble grew, deepening into a sustained roar that announced itself not with drama but with absolute inevitability. Someone in the operations center whispered a call sign into the static, half question, half prayer. The mountains kept their secrets a moment longer. Then the radio erupted with a voice that carried exhaustion, defiance, and the particular satisfaction of someone who just made death blink first. Rene Vasquez had not planned on becoming a pilot. She'd grown up in Espanola, New Mexico, where the sky was vast and empty and the most common aircraft were medical helicopters ferrying patients to Santa Fe. Her father had worked road construction, her mother had cleaned houses, and the word officer meant police, not someone who commanded million-dollar machines. At 17, she joined the Air Force because college wasn't happening any other way, and because a recruiter had shown her a photograph of an A-10 and told her those things saved lives. She'd scored high enough on the entrance exams to shock her guidance counselor and herself. Basic training at Lackland had been a lesson in endurance and erasure, learning to disappear into formations and protocols. Technical school had been worse, filled with men who assumed her hands were too small for throttles and her voice too soft for radio calls under fire. She'd finished 3rd in her class and received congratulations that felt like accusations. Pilot training had been the crucible. The washout rate hovered around 30%, and every instructor had watched her with the specific attention reserved for people expected to fail. She'd thrown up after her first high-G maneuver, hyperventilated during her 2nd solo flight, and nearly quit after a landing so hard it bent the nose gear. But she'd also learned that fear could be partitioned, stored in rooms of the mind accessed only after the aircraft was chocked and the engine silent. Her call sign had come during advanced training, during a night exercise when her flight lead had criticized her approach vector. She'd responded with a technical explanation delivered in a tone so dry it could have started fires, concluding with a recommendation that perhaps the major should review the engagement parameters himself. The other pilots in the debrief had laughed. Someone had muttered "spiteful little thing," and the name had stuck, shortened to Spite. She'd worn it like armor. By the time she'd reached her operational squadron, Spite had learned to be competent enough to be undeniable and quiet enough to be overlooked. She flew her sorties, logged her hours, and ignored the subtle ways she remained separate from the brotherhood of pilots. They'd drink together and swap stories, and she'd be invited with the careful politeness usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. She'd never pushed into those spaces, until Afghanistan. The deployment had come during her third year as a fully qualified A-10 pilot. Her squadron had rotated into Bagram to provide close air support for ground operations throughout Regional Command East, a vast territory of mountains, valleys, and villages, where the war had settled into a grim routine of ambushes and airstrikes. The A-10 community was small, insular, a collection of pilots who'd chosen an aircraft that the Air Force had tried to retire a dozen times, an ugly, slow, beloved machine built around a cannon and armored with titanium bathtubs protecting the cockpit. Spite had loved the A-10 from her first flight in it. The aircraft handled like a truck, responded with the grace of something designed for function rather than elegance, and could absorb damage that would down sleeker jets. During pre-deployment training, she'd studied gun runs until she could call out angles and velocities in her sleep, practiced visual identification of ground targets, until she could distinguish a motorcycle from a recoilless rifle at 3,000 feet. Her flight commander had signed off on her deployment readiness with a notation that she was technically proficient but lacks operational aggression. She'd read it and said nothing. Afghanistan had been heat and dust and waiting. The operations tempo had been relentless but predictable, most days consisting of airborne alert missions, where she'd circle designated areas for hours, waiting for troops in contact calls that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The Taliban had learned to time their attacks for when air support was transitioning or out of station, brief violent engagements designed to inflict casualties before disappearing. Spite had flown 37 sorties in her first 2 months, expended her cannon on 12 of them, and never saw the results beyond technical confirmations from ground controllers. She'd return to base, debrief, eat, sleep, and fly again. The routine had been almost comforting until the morning the mission brief included words like high-value target and Korangal Valley, and she'd seen the other pilots exchange glances that meant everyone knew the valley's reputation. The Korangal had a nickname that no one used in official briefings, the Valley of Death. American forces had fought there for years, pouring blood and ordnance into a landscape that seemed designed to consume both. The valley ran northeast, a narrow corridor flanked by mountains that rose 7,000 feet and hid cave systems, trails, and fighters who'd been waging war since before Spite had been born. The mission brief had been straightforward in the way that dangerous operations always were. Words like direct action and suspected HVT compound, doing the work of acknowledging risk without dwelling on it. A SEAL team would insert at night, move to the target, conduct the raid, and extract before dawn. Air support would orbit nearby, ready to respond if things deteriorated. Spite had been assigned as one of 2 A-10s on station, flying in a loose formation with Captain James "Hammer" Keller, a pilot with 3 deployments and a reputation for textbook gun runs. During the brief, Hammer had looked at her once, a glance that suggested he'd be doing the actual work while she provided backup. She'd nodded and said nothing. The night flight to the valley had been smooth, the aircraft climbing through clear air toward a moon 3 days from full. Spite had checked her systems, confirmed her weapons load, and settled into the rhythm of flight. Below, the mountains were shadows within shadows, defined only by absence. The SEAL team's insertion had gone without incident, their helicopters dropping low and fast before disappearing back toward friendly territory. For 2 hours, Spite and Hammer had orbited at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, close enough to respond within minutes. The radio had been quiet except for periodic checks from the ground team, calm voices reporting progress. Then the voices had changed pitch. The first indication of trouble had been a radio call that started calm and ended clipped. Enemy fighters moving toward the compound, more than expected. The SEAL team breaking contact and moving to a secondary extraction point. Spite had descended to 10,000 feet, scanning through her targeting pod for heat signatures and movement. The valley had appeared peaceful, a winding thread of darker shadow cutting through mountains rendered gray-green by night vision. Then the radio had erupted with overlapping transmissions, automatic weapons fire audible in the background, someone calling for immediate air support with coordinates that placed the team on a ridgeline with no cover. Hammer had responded first, rolling into an attack run that brought him down through the darkness with the confidence of repetition. Spite had watched his aircraft descend, the A-10's distinctive shape visible in moonlight, angular and aggressive. His cannon had fired, a sustained burst that sounded like thunder being torn apart, tracers arcing down toward coordinates that glowed on her display. The ground controller had confirmed hits, requested another pass, and Spite had begun her own descent. The first pass had been textbook. She'd approached from the south, following the valley floor before pulling up and rolling inverted to acquire the target. Through her targeting pod, she'd seen heat signatures clustered behind rocks, muzzle flashes winking in and out of existence. She'd rolled wings level, put the pipper on target and pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 had fired with its characteristic sound, a mechanical roar that resonated through the airframe. 7 seconds of fire, 65 rounds downrange, and the heat signatures had scattered. She'd pulled hard, climbing back to altitude while the ground controller called out effective fire and requested immediate re-attack. Hammer had made another pass, then her, a rhythm establishing itself as they took turns diving into the valley while the SEALs moved toward their extraction point, fighting in short bursts between sprints across open ground. On her third pass, Spite had seen something that changed the geometry of the fight. Additional heat signatures were moving along a ravine that paralleled the SEAL team's route, a flanking element that would cut them off before they reached extraction. She'd called it out, received acknowledgement, and made a decision that felt inevitable. The ravine was narrow, walls close enough that wingspan mattered, and flying through it meant descending below the level of terrain on either side, surrendering altitude and maneuverability for a firing solution that might save the team below. Hammer had been climbing out of his own run when she'd announced her intentions, his voice sharp on the radio telling her to wait, to let him set up a different angle. She'd already been committed. The A-10 had descended into the ravine with the mountains rising on either side, close enough that she'd felt their presence rather than seen it. Her airspeed had dropped to 250 knots, slow enough to aim, fast enough to maneuver. The targeting pod had shown enemy fighters moving in a column, weapons visible. She'd aligned the aircraft, let the pipper settle and fired. The cannon had roared, the aircraft had shuddered, and rounds had marched through the ravine floor, chewing apart rock and flesh in concealment. She'd held the trigger for 8 seconds, expending 90 rounds before pulling up hard. The climb had been steep, the aircraft clawing for altitude while the ravine walls blurred past. At the top of the climb, as she'd begun to level off, something had struck the aircraft. Not a large explosion, but a sharp metallic impact that transmitted through the control stick and was followed immediately by warning lights in the cockpit. Fire detection in the left engine, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical system showing failures. She'd instinctively moved through emergency procedures, shutting down the damaged engine, checking redundant systems, assessing whether the aircraft would continue flying. The A-10 had been designed to absorb damage, with redundant hydraulics, separated flight controls, and engines mounted high to protect them from ground fire. The aircraft had continued flying, but poorly. The left engine was offline, the right engine running at full power to compensate, and several flight control surfaces were responding sluggishly. Spite had turned toward the egress route, announcing her situation on the radio with the calm that came from training and adrenaline. Hammer had responded immediately, moving to escort position, his voice urgent but controlled. Then the radios had died. Not just one, all of them, the primary and backup communication systems failing simultaneously as electrical damage propagated through systems. She tried the emergency radio, the handheld backup, even cycling power to the communications panel. Nothing. The realization had settled over her like cold water. She was flying a damaged aircraft through mountainous terrain at night with no way to communicate her position or status. The SEAL team on the ground wouldn't know if she was still airborne. The operations center would see her transponder disappear and assume the worst. Hammer would report what he'd seen, but couldn't follow her into terrain without risking his own aircraft. She'd been alone in a way that felt absolute. The immediate problem had been navigation. Her primary flight instruments were functioning, but the GPS display was flickering, and several backup systems were offline. She'd had a general heading toward Bagram, but the direct route crossed mountains that required altitude she wasn't certain the damaged aircraft could achieve. The alternative was following valleys, staying low where the air was thicker, and the single remaining engine could provide sufficient thrust. She'd chosen the valleys. For 11 minutes, Spite had flown through darkness with only her instruments and the vague sense of terrain rising on either side. The aircraft had vibrated with the asymmetric thrust, pulling left constantly, requiring steady pressure on the rudder to maintain heading. Warning lights had continued illuminating, a cascade of failures that she'd acknowledged and ignored because the only relevant fact was that the aircraft was still flying. She'd thought about ejecting. The option had been there, obvious and safe, pulling the handles and trusting the ejection seat to clear her from the aircraft before the parachute deployed. But ejection in mountains at night meant landing somewhere unknown, possibly injured, certainly alone until rescue arrived, if rescue arrived. The SEAL team was still fighting. Hammer was still overhead, and the aircraft, damaged and ungainly, was still responding to her commands. She'd kept flying. The electrical system had partially recovered as damaged circuits rerouted through intact pathways, and after 9 minutes of silence, one radio had crackled back to life. She'd transmitted immediately, her call sign and position, the words emerging hoarse because she'd been holding her breath without realizing it. The response had been instantaneous, Hammer's voice tight with relief, the operations center requesting status, everyone talking at once until she'd cut through with the facts. One engine, limited hydraulics, returning to base. The SEAL team's controller had broken in, asking if she could remain on station, if she had anything left. She'd looked at her fuel gauge, at her weapons display showing 230 rounds remaining in the cannon, at the engine temperature gauge climbing toward red line. The professional response would have been negative, explanations about aircraft limitations and safety regulations. Instead, she'd asked for coordinates. The controller had given them, a new enemy position that threatened the extraction, his voice carrying the weight of men about to die. Spite had turned the aircraft, fighting the damaged controls, descending back into the valley she'd barely escaped. Hammer had called her insane. She'd agreed and kept descending. The final gun run had been less a tactical maneuver than an act of controlled desperation. The A-10 had shuddered as she'd lined up on the coordinates, the single engine screaming at maximum power, hydraulic pressure fluctuating with every control input. She'd seen the target through her targeting pod, enemy fighters positioned in a tree line near the extraction point. The range had been longer than optimal, the angle less than ideal, but she'd compensated with the instinct that came from hours in the cockpit. The Pipper had settled on target. She'd fired. The cannon had roared for 6 seconds, 130 rounds downrange, the recoil slowing the aircraft noticeably. Tracers had walked through the tree line, incendiaries igniting what they touched. The enemy position had disintegrated. She'd pulled up immediately, not waiting for confirmation, the aircraft climbing sluggishly through air that felt thick as water. The controller's voice had come through, breathless and grateful, reporting enemy neutralized and the team moving to extraction. He'd asked if she needed immediate assistance. She'd replied with her heading to Bagram and clicked off the radio before anyone could hear her hands shaking on the controls. The flight back had taken 43 minutes that felt like hours. The right engine had run hot but stable, the hydraulics had maintained minimum pressure, and the flight controls had responded with enough authority to keep the aircraft pointed in the right direction. Spite had flown with the mechanical precision of someone who couldn't afford to think about what happened if any system failed completely. Mountains had given way to foothills, then to the flat expanse approaching Bagram. She'd contacted the tower, declared an emergency, and received immediate clearance to land on any runway with fire crews standing by. The approach had been ugly, the aircraft wallowing through turbulence with asymmetric thrust making every correction an exercise in anticipation. The landing had been controlled chaos. She'd crossed the threshold with the right engine at max power, and the aircraft pulling hard left, corrected with rudder and aileron, felt the main gear touch, and deployed the drag chute. The deceleration had been uneven, the aircraft drifting right before she'd corrected, then overcorrected, the nose wheel finally touching as speed bled off. She'd rolled to the end of the runway and turned onto the taxiway where fire trucks were already converging. Only after she'd shut down the remaining engine, and the canopy had opened to reveal humid night air did her hands start shaking badly enough that she'd had to grip the canopy rail to climb out. The crew chief who'd met her at the aircraft had stared at the damage, at the hydraulic fluid streaking the fuselage and the carbon scoring around the left engine mount, and asked how she'd flown it back. She'd told him the aircraft had done most of the work. He'd pointed to a hole in the left stabilizer large enough to fit a fist through and suggested she buy a lottery ticket. In the operations center, the debrief had been professional and restrained, officers asking questions about timing and systems and weapons effectiveness. She'd answered clearly, describing failures and decisions without embellishment. The colonel who doubted her assignment had listened without expression, then asked a single question. Why had she returned to make the final gun run instead of heading directly to base? She'd met his eyes and told him because the SEALs had needed it. He'd nodded once and dismissed the debrief. 2 days later, the SEAL team had visited her squadron. The team leader, a senior chief with a beard and eyes that suggested he'd forgotten what sleep felt like, had shaken her hand and said his men were alive because she'd refused to quit. The words had been simple, unadorned, and she'd felt something shift in her chest, some weight redistributing. The other pilots in the squadron had started including her differently after that night. Not overtly, not with announcements or ceremonies, but in small gestures that accumulated into belonging. Hammer had bought her a drink and told a story about his own emergency landing, normalizing fear by admitting it. The squadron commander had assigned her to lead flights, trusting her judgment. The maintenance crews had started greeting her by call sign rather than rank. In the weeks that followed, Spite had flown another 48 sorties, each one adding to a reputation that preceded her in briefings and radio calls. Ground controllers requested her by name. Other pilots asked advice about gun runs in complex terrain. She'd become someone who'd proven herself in the only currency that mattered, bringing people home. 3 months into the deployment, she'd been flying a routine patrol when the ground controller had called with a troops in contact situation, Marines pinned down in a compound by accurate sniper fire. The situation had been delicate, friendlies and enemies separated by thin walls and brief distances. She descended carefully, using the targeting pod to identify heat signatures and movement patterns. The sniper had been firing from a window in a building 40 meters from the Marines' position. A cannon run would have destroyed both buildings. Instead, Spite had made a low pass, flying directly over the sniper's position at 300 feet, the aircraft's noise and presence a psychological weapon. The sniper had stopped firing, and the Marines had used the respite to maneuver and neutralize the threat. The controller had thanked her for showing restraint and tactical creativity, words that appeared in her mission report and followed her through subsequent evaluations. Restraint and creativity became her signature, the ability to match force to necessity rather than simply delivering maximum violence. She'd learned that being underestimated had advantages, that expectations lowered meant exceeding them felt revolutionary. By the end of her deployment, Spite had logged 163 combat sorties, expended her cannon on 37 of them, and accumulated stories that other pilots repeated in bars and ready rooms. But the story that defined her was the night she disappeared from radar and returned anyway. The night she'd flown a dying aircraft back into a fight because quitting hadn't occurred to her as an option. The squadron had awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony attended by 2 generals and the SEAL team she'd supported, the medal pinned to her uniform while photographers captured images that would circulate through Air Force public affairs channels. She'd stood at attention, accepted congratulations, and felt mostly tired. The real recognition had come later. In the comments section of a YouTube video someone had posted about the mission, a short documentary narrated with dramatic music and graphics showing her flight path. Thousands of comments, many from veterans who'd called for air support in other valleys on other nights, testified that A-10 pilots were a different breed. One comment from a retired SEAL had simply said, "Even we thought she was done. Then we heard that cannon one more time." The video had gone viral in military communities, racking up millions of views, spawning reaction videos and analysis breakdowns. Spite had become accidentally famous, her call sign recognizable in circles she'd never entered. She'd found the whole thing embarrassing and had refused interview requests, preferring to let the work speak. But the fame had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Young women had started reaching out through Air Force recruiting offices, asking about pilot training and mentioning her name. Aviation forums had dissected her tactics. Other pilots had studied her gun-run profiles, trying to understand the calculations that had let her thread aircraft through terrain others avoided. The deployment had ended, and Spite had rotated back to the United States, to a squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where the landscape was flat, and the missions were training rather than combat. The transition had been jarring, going from daily flights where mistakes meant casualties to routine patterns where the greatest danger was boredom. She'd struggled with the change, finding herself restless during peacetime procedures, missing the clarity of purpose that combat provided. Other veterans understood without explanation the difficulty of caring about regulations and inspections when you'd spent months where only results mattered. She'd adapted slowly, channeling energy into mentoring younger pilots, teaching them not just procedures but judgment, the difference between technical proficiency and actual competence. Her students had called her demanding but fair, someone who expected excellence but provided the tools to achieve it. When asked about her Afghanistan deployment, she downplayed the drama, focusing instead on preparation and systems knowledge, trying to convey that heroism was mostly about being too stubborn to acknowledge when you should quit. The YouTube video had continued growing, accumulating views and spawning articles in aviation magazines and military publications. Journalists had requested interviews, documentary producers had pitched series, and Air Force Public Affairs had suggested she participate in recruiting campaigns. She declined most requests, accepting only those that let her emphasize the team aspects of missions, the ground controllers and maintainers and intelligence officers whose work made flying possible. She'd been uncomfortable with individual recognition for events that required dozens of people functioning correctly. But the story had refused to stay contained, expanding through retellings and embellishments until it bore only tangential relationship to what had actually happened. In the 3rd year after her deployment, Spite had been promoted to major and assigned as the operations officer for her squadron, responsible for scheduling, training, and readiness. The administrative work had been tedious but necessary, learning that leadership meant paperwork and politics as much as flying. She'd approached the job with the same methodical intensity she'd applied to pilot training, studying regulations and building relationships, trying to make systems work for people rather than the other way around. The squadron had flourished under her leadership, readiness scores improving, accident rates dropping, morale rising as pilots recognized that someone prioritized their development over metrics. The squadron commander had written in her evaluation that she leads from the front and never asks subordinates to accept risks she wouldn't take herself. Words that practically guaranteed future promotions. But promotions meant less flying, more managing, a trajectory that pulled her steadily away from the cockpit she'd fought so hard to reach. At 34 years old, Spite had begun confronting the arithmetic of military aviation careers. The better you performed, the less you flew. Senior officers commanded squadrons and groups, attending meetings and making policy while younger pilots accumulated hours. She'd watched other pilots transition to staff positions, trading flight suits for desk jobs, their skills eroding through disuse. Some adapted gracefully, finding satisfaction in shaping strategy and developing others. Others had grown bitter, trapped in careers they no longer recognized. Spite had been uncertain which category she'd occupy, wanting to serve but unwilling to become someone who talked about flying rather than doing it. The question had resolved itself during a training exercise at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, a large force employment that brought together aircraft from multiple bases to practice coordinated strikes. Spite had been flying as part of a strike package targeting a simulated enemy air defense network. Her A-10 tasked with suppressing ground threats while fighters dealt with airborne opposition. The mission had been complex, requiring precise timing and coordination, radio frequencies crowded with traffic as dozens of aircraft maneuvered through compressed airspace. She'd been approaching her target when another pilot had called out a malfunction, a younger captain whose aircraft had lost hydraulic pressure and needed to egress immediately. The captain's voice had carried the edge of panic, words coming fast and uncertain. Spite had responded instinctively, her voice calm and directive, walking him through emergency procedures and providing vectors to the nearest suitable airfield. Other pilots had listened, recognizing competence and following her lead, establishing an impromptu escort that saw the captain safely to the ground. After the exercise, the captain had sought her out, thanking her not just for the assistance but for the tone, the way her voice had cut through his fear and provided structure. He'd admitted being terrified, certain he'd have to eject, and her confidence had convinced him the aircraft could make it. The conversation had crystallized something for Spite. Flying was important, but what she'd really learned from a decade in cockpits was how to function when systems failed and fear threatened to overwhelm judgment. That knowledge could be taught, passed to others who'd faced their own valleys and damaged aircraft. She'd realized that stepping away from flying wasn't abandoning it, but extending its reach, creating more pilots capable of making impossible situations survivable. The recognition had been simultaneously liberating and melancholy, acceptance that one phase was ending while another began. She'd submitted paperwork for a staff position at Air Combat Command Headquarters, a job focused on tactical development and pilot training standards. The assignment had taken her to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, to an office where the view was parking lots rather than runways, where her uniform stayed cleaner and her days ended at reasonable hours. The work had been intellectually challenging, analyzing tactical trends and incorporating lessons from recent operations into training curricula. She'd reviewed gun camera footage, read after-action reports, and consulted with pilots returning from deployments, trying to identify patterns that could save lives. The job had mattered, but it hadn't felt the same. She'd missed the physical sensation of flight, the way aircraft responded to control inputs, the pure focus required to put ordnance on target. Office work required different skills, patience and politics, building consensus among officers who all believed their priorities deserved resources. Spite had approached it methodically, learning who influenced decisions and how arguments needed framing. She'd been moderately successful, implementing changes to close air support training that emphasized communication and precision over simply expending weapons. Pilots had reported the training felt more realistic, better preparing them for actual operations. But success had felt distant, filtered through reports rather than experienced directly. She'd been reviewing a particularly tedious acquisition proposal when her phone had rung, the caller ID showing a Virginia area code she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end had introduced himself as a producer for a production company specializing in military documentaries. They'd wanted to create a feature-length film about her Afghanistan deployment, interviews and reenactments, narration that would bring the story to broader audiences. He'd emphasized the educational value, how her experience could inspire young people and honor those who'd served. The pitch had been polished, appealing to duty and legacy, suggesting that sharing her story was itself a form of service. Spite had declined politely, explaining she preferred privacy and that the story had been told sufficiently. The producer had persisted, mentioning the YouTube video's millions of views, suggesting she had a responsibility to control the narrative before others distorted it. She'd thanked him and ended the call, feeling uncomfortable with the commodification of events that had felt desperate rather than heroic. But the call had prompted reflection about what remained when the flying stopped, what legacy meant beyond medals and efficiency reports. She'd thought about the young women who'd reached out over the years, the ones who'd cited her example when explaining why they'd pursued aviation. She'd thought about the captain at Nellie's, how her calm had mattered more than her skills. Legacy wasn't monuments or documentaries. It was the accumulated effect of actions rippling forward through people influenced and trained. That realization had shifted her perspective on the staff job, recognizing it as an opportunity to shape thousands of pilots she'd never meet, encoding lessons into systems that would persist after she'd retired. The tedious acquisition proposal had suddenly seemed more important, each bureaucratic detail potentially affecting whether pilots had tools they'd need when fear and violence arrived simultaneously. She'd returned to work with renewed focus, accepting that meaningful contributions rarely felt dramatic while happening. 2 years into the staff assignment, Spite had been selected for lieutenant colonel, a promotion that confirmed her trajectory towards senior leadership. The ceremony had been formal, her parents attending and watching with pride they expressed quietly. Her father had shaken her hand and told her he'd always known she'd do important things, words that meant more than any medal. Her mother had hugged her and whispered that she could stop proving herself now, an observation that struck deeper than intended. The promotion had come with reassignment to a flying squadron as deputy commander, a position balancing administrative responsibilities with maintaining currency in the aircraft. Spite had returned to Davis-Monthan, to familiar runways and mountains visible in the distance, feeling like someone returning to a place that had kept evolving during her absence. The squadron had changed, newer pilots who'd been in high school during her deployment, maintainers working with updated tools, procedures refined by accumulated experience. She'd been both insider and outsider, someone with history but needing to relearn current rhythms. The reintegration had been smoother than expected, pilots respecting rank but also reputation, willing to accept leadership from someone who'd proven competence in ways that transcended paperwork. She'd resumed flying, requalifying in the aircraft and discovering that muscle memory persisted even as regulations had changed. The A-10 had felt familiar, the cockpit layout and engine sounds triggering associations built through hundreds of hours. But flying peacetime training missions had lacked the intensity that had defined her deployment, the sense that every action mattered immediately. She'd struggled with the absence, recognizing that combat had provided clarity she'd been chasing ever since, a simplicity of purpose impossible to replicate when consequences were hypothetical. Other veterans had understood, sharing the same quiet frustration during conversations in the bar, the way war had ruined them for normal life by making everything else feel muted. They'd adapted by finding meaning in preparation, training others so rigorously that if war came again, fewer people would die unnecessarily. Spite had adopted the same approach, running exercises that emphasized realistic scenarios and accepting no shortcuts, building a squadron culture where competence wasn't optional. One evening, 6 months into her deputy commander assignment, Spite had been reviewing training schedules when the squadron commander had knocked on her office door. Colonel Marcus Trent was a deliberate officer who'd flown B-52s before transitioning to A-10s late in his career, bringing strategic perspective to a tactical aircraft. He'd sat across from her desk and asked a question that seemed simple. What did she want her career to become? She'd started with the standard answer about serving wherever needed, but he'd waved it off, asking what she actually wanted, stripped of professional obligations and expectations. The question had been harder than anticipated. She'd wanted to fly, but aging and promotion timelines meant that opportunity was closing. She'd wanted to matter, but defining how felt slippery. After a long pause, she told him she wanted to ensure that younger pilots never felt as alone as she'd felt in that valley, that they'd have training and support making survival more likely. Trent had nodded and told her the Air Force was establishing a new training program at Nellis, a graduate-level course for close air support pilots focused on complex scenarios and advanced tactics. They needed someone to design the curriculum and lead the instruction, someone with credibility and recent combat experience. He'd recommended her. The assignment would mean another move, another staff position, but this time building something rather than maintaining it. She'd accepted before he'd finished explaining the details. The move to Nellis had happened within 3 months, Spite relocating to Las Vegas and diving into curriculum development with the intensity that had defined her pilot training. She'd assembled a team of instructors from multiple airframes, incorporating perspectives beyond just A-10 tactics. The course she designed had emphasized decision-making under pressure, communications with ground forces, and understanding the strategic implications of tactical actions. Students had spent weeks in simulators facing scenarios with no clean solutions, learning that competence meant accepting risk and choosing least bad options. Spite had taught several blocks herself, sharing stories from Afghanistan not as war tales, but as case studies in judgment and adaptation. The students had responded enthusiastically, recognizing someone teaching from experience rather than theory. Course critiques had been overwhelmingly positive, graduates reporting they'd felt genuinely prepared for deployment challenges. The program had expanded, adding classes and bringing in guest instructors from special operations units. Spite had been promoted to full colonel 2 years after arriving at Nellis, a rank that brought significant administrative responsibilities, but also authority to protect the program's integrity. She'd fought bureaucratic battles to maintain standards, resisting pressure to increase throughput at the expense of quality, arguing that undertrained pilots endangered ground forces. She'd mostly won those battles, accepting compromises only when absolutely necessary and documenting objections for the record. Her reputation as difficult but principled had grown, superiors knowing she'd argue fiercely but execute decisions loyally. At 41 years old, Spite had accumulated 22 years of service and faced the question every career officer eventually confronted: whether to pursue general officer rank or transition to civilian life. The decision carried weight, generals shaping policy affecting thousands, their choices cascading through organizations. But generals rarely flew, their expertise ossifying into memories while they attended conferences and managed headquarters staffs. Spite had watched other officers navigate the transition, some flourishing in strategic roles while others seemed diminished by distance from the work that had defined them. She'd been considering the decision when a former student had called from Afghanistan, a captain whose voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from sustained combat operations. He'd wanted advice about a tactical problem: enemy fighters using a mosque as a firing position, creating moral and legal complexities around engagement. They'd talked for 40 minutes, Spite asking questions that helped him clarify his thinking rather than providing answers. At the call's end, he'd thanked her and mentioned that her training had saved his life multiple times, that he'd recognize situations because she'd prepared him for them. The call had clarified her decision. Generals might shape policy, but instructors shaped pilots who saved lives. The impact was less visible but more direct. She'd submitted retirement paperwork 3 days later, announcing her intention to separate from service after 2 decades. The decision had shocked colleagues who'd assumed she'd pursue stars. Her commander had tried convincing her to reconsider, noting her promotion potential and the influence she could wield. She'd explained that influence mattered less than impact, and she'd found meaningful work that didn't require rank. He'd accepted her decision with visible disappointment. The retirement ceremony had been held at Nellie's on a clear morning with mountains framing the flight line. Standard military protocol, speeches about service and sacrifice, presentation of the flag, and a medal commemorating her career. Spite had stood at attention, listening to accomplishments enumerated in language that felt simultaneously accurate and alien, her career summarized in bullet points that missed the texture of actual experience. Former squadron mates had attended, some traveling across the country, their presence meaning more than any official recognition. The SEAL team leader from Afghanistan had come, older but still carrying himself with coiled readiness. He'd hugged her after the ceremony, told her his daughter had joined the Air Force and was starting pilot training, inspired by a story about an A-10 pilot who'd refused to quit. The words had made the entire career feel justified, validation that extended beyond personal achievement. The reception afterward had been casual, people sharing stories and speculating about her plans. She'd been vague, mentioning consulting work and time off, unwilling to commit to specifics. Truth was, she'd been uncertain what came next. Civilian life required different skills, demanded new identities beyond rank and aircraft. Other retirees had warned her about the adjustment, the way structure's absence could feel liberating and terrifying simultaneously. She'd smiled and accepted advice, storing it against future need. In the weeks following retirement, Spite had discovered that civilians struggled with her name. Nobody called her Spite, the call sign feeling out of place without flight suits and briefings. Her given name, Renee, sounded strange after years of hearing it rarely. She'd experimented with both, eventually accepting Renee in professional contexts while remaining Spite to military friends. The divided identity had felt appropriate, acknowledgement that military service had changed her irrevocably, while civilian life required new adaptations. She'd rented an apartment in Las Vegas, planning to stay near Nellie's while determining next steps. Consulting offers had arrived from defense contractors wanting her expertise in close air support tactics and training development. She'd accepted a few projects, finding the work interesting but hollow, recommendations disappearing into corporate structures without clear implementation. The lack of direct impact had frustrated her, making military service feel more meaningful in hindsight. She'd been 6 months into retirement when the YouTube video had resurfaced, boosted by an algorithm or renewed interest, climbing back to millions of views. The comments section had filled with new perspectives, veterans sharing their own stories of air support saving their lives, younger people asking about pilot training, conspiracy theorists suggesting the mission had been exaggerated. Spite had read through them with mixed feelings, appreciating genuine gratitude while cringing at misconceptions. One comment thread had debated whether she'd been reckless or heroic, the discussion growing heated as people projected their own values onto events they hadn't experienced. She'd resisted the urge to comment, knowing that participation would only generate more attention. But the video's resurgence had brought interview requests, this time with more persistent follow-up. A producer from a major streaming platform had offered substantial money for exclusive rights to her story, suggesting a prestige miniseries with A-list actors and careful military consultation. The pitch had emphasized authenticity and respect, promising she'd have approval over scripts. The money had been enough to secure her financial future, funding comfortable retirement or investment in projects she cared about. She'd been tempted, imagining resources enabling work she couldn't afford otherwise. But accepting meant relinquishing control of her narrative, trusting others to represent events they'd never lived. She'd requested time to consider, using the delay to consult friends whose opinions she trusted. Their advice had been mixed, some encouraging her to capitalize on her story, while others warned about Hollywood's tendency toward distortion. The decision had been complicated by competing values: privacy versus potential impact, control versus compensation. She'd ultimately declined, explaining to the producer that her story wasn't hers alone, that representing it accurately would require involving dozens of others who might not consent. He'd been disappointed but professional, leaving the offer open if she changed her mind. Spite had felt relief at the decision, recognizing she'd prioritized integrity over opportunity. But declining had left the question of purpose unresolved, retirement stretching forward without clear direction. She'd begun flying civilian aircraft, renting small planes and exploring desert landscapes from altitudes where details emerged slowly. The flying had been peaceful, lacking the intensity of military operations but providing the physical sensation she'd missed. She'd considered becoming a flight instructor, teaching civilians the basics she'd mastered decades ago. The work would have been simple, repetitive, an inversion of her career trajectory. But simplicity had appealed after years of complexity. The idea of teaching someone to land smoothly feeling valuable in direct, measurable ways. She'd obtained the necessary certifications and started instructing part-time at a local flight school, discovering that civilian students required different teaching approaches than military pilots. They'd lacked the urgency and focus that military training instilled, approaching flying as recreation rather than profession. The adjustment had required patience, learning to celebrate small victories and accept that not everyone aspired to perfection. Some students had been talented, absorbing concepts quickly and demonstrating natural aptitude. Others had struggled with basics, requiring repeated instruction and encouragement. Spite had found satisfaction in both, recognizing that progress mattered regardless of pace. Her reputation had eventually reached students, someone mentioning her military background and posting about it online. Interest had increased, people specifically requesting her as an instructor. She'd been uncomfortable with the attention, but had accepted that reputation followed whether she wanted it or not. The flight school's owner had suggested she teach advanced courses, aerobatics and mountain flying, skills beyond basic certification. She'd agreed, designing curriculum that emphasized risk management and decision-making, trying to instill the judgment that had mattered more than stick skills in her military career. The teaching had been fulfilling but incomplete, scratching the surface of what she'd wanted to accomplish. At 43 years old, having spent 2 years in retirement, Spite had begun considering larger projects. The consulting work had provided income but no legacy. Flight instruction had been satisfying but limited in scope. She'd wanted to create something enduring, infrastructure that would persist beyond her involvement. The idea had come during a conversation with a former student who'd mentioned the lack of quality training materials for close air support tactics, existing resources either classified or outdated. Commercial flight simulation had advanced significantly, hardware and software capable of replicating complex scenarios. Spite had recognized an opportunity, creating civilian-accessible training that could supplement military instruction, providing a resource for pilots worldwide. The project would require significant investment, expertise she'd need to acquire, and time measured in years. But the vision had appealed, combining her tactical knowledge with technology to extend her impact exponentially. She'd begun researching, contacting software developers and simulation companies, sketching out curriculum structures and scenario designs. The work had consumed her attention, providing the sense of purpose she'd been seeking. 9 months into development, with a prototype simulation showing promise, Spite had received a call that recontextualized everything. The caller had been a colonel from Air Combat Command, someone she'd worked with during her staff assignment. After brief pleasantries, He'd explained that the Air Force was reevaluating pilot retention and expertise utilization. They'd identified recently retired pilots with critical skills and combat experience, offering temporary recall to active duty for specific assignments. Her name had been on a very short list. The assignment would be instructing at the Weapons School, the Air Force's graduate-level tactical training program, teaching the most promising pilots advanced close air support techniques. The tour would last 2 years, enough time to shape a generation of flight leaders. He'd emphasized that she'd have significant autonomy over curriculum, that her expertise was precisely what the program needed. The offer had been unexpected, providing an opportunity to return to work she'd loved without committing to a full career. But accepting meant abandoning civilian projects, reinserting herself into military